A dog walked into the hospital on a mission no one could believe. What happened next left everyone in tears. Luke, a large, golden-furred dog, walked slowly on the hospital's corridors. The space was wrapped in the kind of stillness that only comes in the dead of night. The hum of machines and faint footsteps were the only sounds that dared break the oppressive quiet. Sandra, the head nurse, rushed down the hall, her heart pounding from the urgency of the situation in the emergency room. But as she turned the corner, something made her pause. At the far end of the hallway, Luke was there. His age showed in the soft greying of his muzzle, but his eyes were sharp, almost knowing. He stood there, calm, unflinching, as though waiting for something or someone. Sandra blinked, unsure if the exhaustion was playing tricks on her mind. Dogs weren't allowed in the hospital. Why did the dog get in here? For a moment, Sandra felt the urge to approach him, to see if he belonged to someone. But the shrill sound of a monitor alarm snapped her back to reality. She tore her gaze away from the dog and hurried into the emergency room. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Henry, a 2-year-old boy, was fighting for his life. His small body, pale and still, lay surrounded by wires and machines that monitored every fragile breath. Doctors, Jackson and Amy were focused, their hands working methodically as they fought to save him. Sandra joined them at the bedside, her pulse matching the erratic beeping of Henry's heart monitor. The room was filled with the scent of antiseptic and sweat. Henry's condition had worsened through the night, his heart weakening until it finally stopped. Time of death. Dr. Jackson began, his voice faltering as he looked at the clock. He hated these moments, the finality of them, the acceptance of defeat. Amy's hand trembled as she reached for the medical chart, her face a mask of sorrow. But before Jackson could finish the sentence, the monitor beeped. One faint sound, then another. Henry's heart, against all odds, began to beat again. A gasp filled the room as everyone stared at the screen, unable to believe what they were seeing. Henry's small chest rose and fell in shallow but steady breaths. It was as if life had returned to him in the most inexplicable way. Sandra stepped back, her mind racing. What had just happened? She had been a nurse long enough to know the harsh realities of life and death. But this was different. Feeling a wave of dizziness, she left the room to catch her breath. As she stepped into the corridor, her eyes landed on the golden dog again, Luke. He was no longer at the end of the hall, but standing right outside the emergency room, his calm eyes watching her with an intensity that sent a shiver down her spine. Sandra looked around, hoping to spot someone who might have brought the dog inside, but there was no one. The hospital was empty, quiet, as though it had become a different world entirely. Both Jackson and Amy were baffled, unable to grasp why the dog had appeared. Their minds swirled with questions, but the weight of the night's emergency had drained them. They left, brushing off the bizarre incident. Only Sandra stayed behind, her curiosity lingering. Luke's presence didn't feel threatening. If anything, there was something oddly comforting about him. She hesitated for a moment, her instincts urging her to shoo him away, to follow hospital protocol. But something stopped her. There was a connection she couldn't explain, a pull between the dog and the boy inside that room. By the time Henry was stable enough to be moved to the special care unit, Luke was still there, waiting silently. As the nurses wheeled Henry's bed down the hallway, Luke followed, his steps quiet, his presence steady. He walked with purpose, as though he had a job to do. Sandra watched, her heart pounding with confusion, and something else she couldn't name, hope, maybe. She trailed behind them, unsure whether to intervene or let the strange events unfold. When they reached Henry's room, Luke padded softly inside, lying down beside the boy's bed, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The soft rise and fall of Henry's breathing seemed to sync with Luke's, creating a rhythm of peace in the sterile, clinical environment. Sandra stood at the door, her hands trembling. There was something here, something beyond medicine, beyond science. Luke wasn't just any dog. He was here for a reason. And though she couldn't explain it, she felt in her bones that Henry's miraculous recovery had something to do with him. And for the first time that night, Sandra didn't question the impossible. She simply accepted it. The soft hum of machines filled the small hospital room where Henry lay, his frail body surrounded by wires and monitors. He was trapped in a deep coma, his breathing shallow, each rise and fall of his chest monitored carefully. The doctors had done all they could, but the outlook was bleak. Henry's condition hadn't improved, and the shadow of death seemed to hover over him. Day after day, Sandra watched as hope slowly drained from the faces of the medical team. They had seen too many cases like this, where no amount of medicine could pull a child back from the brink. Luke had quietly settled at the foot of Henry's bed the previous night, as if he belonged there. His soft golden fur seemed to shimmer under the dim hospital lights, his presence calm and steady, like an anchor in the storm. No one knew where he had come from, but strangely, no one questioned it. He wasn't just any dog. There was something about him that made everyone feel at ease. Sandra, standing by the door, watched as Luke rested his head gently on the floor, his eyes fixed on Henry. Her mind raced with questions, but there was an inexplicable sense of peace in the room now, a peace she hadn't felt since Henry was first brought in. "He shouldn't be here," Dr. Jackson murmured, his voice low but tense. He stood beside Dr. Amy, both of them staring at the dog as if expecting him to suddenly cause trouble. "He's not doing any harm," Sandra replied softly, her gaze not leaving Luke. "Look at Henry. He's calmer." Dr. Amy crossed her arms, her brows furrowed with concern. "It's not about harm, Sandra. This is a hospital, and we don't allow animals in intensive care units, let alone near a critical patient." Sandra turned toward them, her voice steady, but carrying the weight of her own doubts. "I know it sounds strange, but I can't shake the feeling that Luke being here, it's helping Henry. Look at him." She pointed to the heart monitor that showed a steady rhythm, more consistent than it had been in days. Henry, though still unconscious, looked more peaceful. His tiny body, which had been restless even in sleep, now lay still, his breathing softer. Jackson shook his head, clearly unconvinced. "It's just a coincidence. We can't let emotions interfere with what's happening here. We need to follow protocol." Sandra's eyes flickered with frustration. "And what has protocol gotten us so far? We've been watching him deteriorate for days, and now, out of nowhere, he's stabilizing. Don't you think it's worth considering that maybe, just maybe, this isn't a coincidence?" Amy sighed, the exhaustion of long hours and unanswered questions weighing on her. She glanced at the dog, who hadn't moved since entering the room. "What are you suggesting, Sandra? That the dog is, what, some kind of miracle worker?" Sandra didn't answer immediately. She couldn't explain what she felt, but it was there, a certainty she couldn't deny. "All I'm saying is, look at the boy. He's not slipping away like before. His vitals are holding steady. We're not losing him tonight." The room fell into a heavy silence, the tension thick but tempered by the rhythmic beeping of the machines. Luke, oblivious to the debate happening around him, closed his eyes but remained alert, his body positioned protectively beside Henry. Minutes passed, each one feeling like an eternity, as the medical team waited for some sign that they should intervene. But nothing happened. Henry slept soundly, his heart rate steady, his breathing calm. It was as if the storm that had raged inside him was finally at rest. Amy spoke first, her voice softer, as if unsure of what she was even saying. Maybe it's okay if we let the dog stay for now. Just for tonight. We'll see what happens in the morning. Jackson glanced at her, clearly surprised by her change in tone, but he said nothing. He too could feel the shift in the air, something subtle but undeniable. Reluctantly, he nodded. Sandra exhaled, feeling a weight lift from her chest. Luke remained where he was, a silent sentinel watching over Henry. Whatever this strange connection was, it brought a peace none of them could explain. And for now, that was enough. The night deepened, but in the quiet, Henry's steady breaths echoed with a new hope. The hospital room was cloaked in a stillness that had settled like a heavy blanket over the past few weeks. Monitors hummed softly in the background, their rhythmic beeps the only sign that life still lingered. Henry lay motionless, his small body cocooned in wires and tubes, a fragile vessel that had been adrift between life and death for too long. Sandra stood by the door, her eyes fixed on the boy's frail form, her heart heavy with both hope and dread. Days had passed since the doctors had last seen any sign of movement, but she couldn't bring herself to give up. Not yet. And then there was Luke. Luke, the old golden retriever, had not left Henry's side since the boy was brought into this room. The dog lay curled at the foot of the bed, his eyes, though weary with age, never strayed from the boy. There was something about his presence, something unexplainable. Sandra couldn't shake the feeling that Luke was not here by accident. It was a quiet morning, the kind that made the hospital feel like it was holding its breath. Sandra was preparing to step out when she noticed it. A slight twitch, a subtle movement in Henry's hand. She froze. Was she imagining it? Her heart raced and she leaned closer, her eyes wide with disbelief. "Henry," she whispered, though she knew the boy was far too deep in his unconscious state to respond. But there it was again, the small flicker of his fingers. Sandra's breath caught in her throat. After weeks of nothing, this was the first sign that something was stirring inside the boy, something none of them had dared to hope for. She quickly pressed the call button, summoning Dr. Jackson and Amy. When they arrived, Sandra pointed silently to Henry's hand, still trembling with faint movements. Dr. Jackson stepped forward, his usual steely composure cracking ever so slightly. He examined the boy, his eyes scanning the monitors, then the child, then back to the machines. His hands worked methodically, but the confusion in his face betrayed him. "This can't be," Jackson muttered under his breath. "After everything." Amy, standing just behind him, had tears already welling in her eyes. She placed a gentle hand on Sandra's shoulder, the unspoken emotion passing between them. None of this made sense. None of it could be explained. But in this room, it didn't need to be. Henry's movements grew stronger, his tiny fingers curling and flexing with more intention. Sandra's heart swelled. Luke remained at the boy's side, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes stayed fixed on Henry. It was as if the dog had known this moment was coming all along, waiting patiently for the boy to rejoin the world. Sandra took a step closer to the bed, watching intently. A soft murmur escaped Henry's lips, a sound so faint that for a moment she thought she had imagined it. But no, he was waking up. Slowly, painfully, but surely, he was coming back. Luke, as if sensing the shift, lifted his head. The old dog's eyes locked onto Henry's face, and for a long moment, there was nothing but the quiet connection between them. It was as though Luke was drawing Henry back from the brink, offering the boy a silent, unspoken reassurance. And then, just as the room seemed to hold its breath, Henry's eyes fluttered open. The world slowed. The lights overhead seemed to dim. The beeping of the monitors receded into the background, and all that existed was the boy and the dog. Henry's gaze found Luke's, and though the child's face was pale and weak, there was a calmness in his expression, a peace that Sandra had never seen before. Luke, ever still, watched with his deep, ancient eyes, as though he had been waiting for this very moment. There was no barking, no movement, just an understanding between the two, as if Luke had been more than a guardian, but a guide. Sandra felt her throat tighten, tears threatening to spill. Even Dr. Jackson, the man of science, stood frozen in place, his disbelief slowly crumbling into awe. "How?" Amy whispered, her voice shaking. "How is this happening?" No one answered. There were no words that could explain what they had just witnessed. But in that room, at that moment, explanations didn't matter. All that mattered was that Henry was awake, alive, and Luke, the quiet sentinel by his side, had played a role none of them could comprehend. In the stillness that followed, a profound peace settled over them all, as if, for now, they didn't need to question the miracle that had unfolded before their eyes. The sterile white walls of the hospital felt like they held 1,000 stories, but today they were about to witness a reunion more profound than most. Mr. and Mrs. Knight hurried through the sliding glass doors, their footsteps echoing in the empty corridor as they approached the intensive care unit. The news of their son's sudden recovery had pulled them back from a long business trip overseas. Now they rushed forward, hearts pounding with both fear and hope, desperate to see Henry, their little boy who had been teetering on the edge of life and death. Mrs. Knight's fingers trembled as she clutched her husband's arm. "Do you think he's really improving?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Knight's jaw tightened, his eyes focused straight ahead. "Let's just see for ourselves," he replied, though his own uncertainty hung in the air between them. As they reached Henry's room, the door was slightly ajar, and the faint hum of machines could be heard within. Pushing it open softly, they stepped inside, only to stop in their tracks. There, lying beside Henry's bed, was Luke. His golden fur, now tinged with the grey of old age, shone faintly under the hospital lights. The dog lay curled up, as if he had been waiting for their arrival. Mrs. Knight gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Luke," she whispered in disbelief, "how is he here? He could barely stand before we left." Mr. Knight moved closer to the bed, his expression unreadable. Luke's soft eyes flickered up to meet his gaze, but the dog remained still, as if knowing that his presence required no explanation. "He's been here the whole time," came a soft voice from the doorway. It was Sandra, the head nurse, who had watched Luke's silent vigil since the moment Henry had been moved to this room. "None of us are quite sure how he got here, but he's been with Henry since yesterday. We haven't had the heart to move him." Mr. and Mrs. Knight stood there, stunned. They had left Luke at home, weak and barely able to walk. Mrs. Knight knelt down next to Luke, her fingers brushing lightly over his fur. Tears welled up in her eyes as she spoke softly to him. "You've always been there for him, haven't you, Luke? From the day Henry was born, you've never left his side." Sandra, standing nearby, could feel the weight of the moment. She had heard stories like this before, stories of animals and the unexplainable bond they shared with their humans. But seeing it unfold in front of her was something else entirely. "It's like he knew," Sandra said quietly. "Like he knew Henry needed him." Mrs. Knight nodded, wiping away a tear. "Luke's been with us for so long, 17 years. He's been a part of this family. And he and Henry, they've always had a special connection. She looked up at Sandra, her voice breaking. Even when Henry was a newborn baby, Luke would sit by his crib for hours, just watching him sleep. I always thought it was strange, but maybe he was watching over him. Dr. Jackson entered the room, having overheard the conversation. His eyes softened as he took in the scene. "There's something here that goes beyond what any of us can explain," he said. "Henry's recovery. It's nothing short of miraculous. And seeing this, well, it's hard not to think there's something more at play." The room fell silent, the weight of the moment settling around them. Luke, ever vigilant, remained by Henry's side, his presence calming and purposeful. The doctors, the nurses, the knights themselves, no one could fully explain it, but they all felt it. Luke was here for a reason. As the beeps of the heart monitor filled the room, steady and strong, Mrs. Knight reached for her husband's hand. Maybe, just maybe, Luke was meant to be here. For Henry. For all of us. Mr. Knight, silent but deeply moved, nodded in agreement. Whatever the reason, whatever the mystery, Luke's presence in this hospital room had changed everything. The next day, Henry, the small boy who had been balancing on the edge between life and death, was beginning to stir. His eyes fluttered open slowly, their brightness returning as he blinked, taking in the world around him. Each breath came a little stronger, each movement a little more certain. Beside him, Luke lay quietly, his golden fur duller now, and his once strong, steady breaths were shallow and labored. The old dog had reached his limit. Sandra, the head nurse, stood at the foot of the bed, her heart heavy with a strange mix of hope and sorrow. She had watched as Henry fought for his life, and though the boy had found his way back, it was clear that Luke was slipping away. Henry's parents, the Knights, were seated nearby, watching their son with tear-filled eyes. Mrs. Knight clutched her husband's hand, her knuckles white with the strength of her grip. The gratitude they felt for Luke's presence was overwhelming, but the weight of knowing they were watching the dog's final moments pressed down on them, a shared pain they couldn't escape. "He's waking up," Mrs. Knight whispered, her voice cracking with emotion as Henry's small hand moved weakly toward her. "He's really waking up." She choked on the words, her eyes darting to Luke, who remained perfectly still beside the boy's crib, his head resting gently on the floor. Luke had been there since the beginning, through Henry's darkest moments. Now, as the boy came back to life, the dog seemed to be fading, his old body no longer able to sustain the same battle. His breaths came slower, his body still but for the subtle rise and fall of his chest. It was as if he had given everything, leaving nothing for himself. "Luke too weak," Mr. Knight murmured, his voice soft but full of sadness as he looked at Luke. He's given all he could." Sandra could feel the tension in the room, the emotional heaviness that weighed on each of them. She glanced at Dr. Jackson and Amy, who were standing silently by the door. They, too, had witnessed the miracle, Henry's inexplicable recovery. And though they couldn't explain it with science, they all knew that Luke's presence had been far more than just a coincidence. Luke shifted slightly, his body trembling as he pressed closer to Henry's bedside. There was no doubt in anyone's mind what was happening. His final act was one of quiet, selfless sacrifice, remaining by Henry's side, as if transferring the last of his strength to the boy he had protected. Tears welled in Sandra's eyes as she stepped forward, unable to stay on the sidelines any longer. She knelt beside Luke, her hand gently resting on his head. His fur was warm, but his energy was fading fast. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thank you for saving him." Behind her, Mrs. Knight broke down, unable to hold back her tears any longer. "He's leaving us, isn't he?" she asked, her voice trembling. Jackson stepped forward, his face softened with emotion. "Yes, but not without giving us all something we can't explain," he said quietly. He knelt beside Sandra, his eyes misty. "This goes beyond anything I've ever seen." Luke's body trembled one last time before it stilled completely. The room fell into a deep silence, the kind that makes time stand still. For a long moment, no one moved. Henry, now fully awake, looked around the room, his eyes landing on Luke. His small voice broke the quiet. "Luke." Sandra swallowed hard, her tears finally spilling over. She gently stroked Luke's fur one last time, then looked up at Henry with a soft smile through her tears. "Yes, Henry. He's a very special dog. And he helped you." The Knights stood beside their son, their grief mingled with overwhelming gratitude. Luke had been a guardian, a protector, and in the end he had given everything to bring Henry back. No one spoke for a long time. There were no words that could capture what they had just witnessed. But in that quiet hospital room, they all knew that Luke had given them a gift far beyond understanding, a miracle that would stay with them forever. The room was bathed in a quiet stillness, broken only by the soft beeping of the monitors and the rhythmic hum of the machines. Henry lay in his bed, his small chest rising and falling, the peaceful breath of someone who had drifted back from the edge of the abyss. Sandra stood by the door, watching him, her heart heavy yet filled with a strange calm. Then, as if the world had shifted, Henry's eyes fluttered open. His gaze, bright and curious, swept across the room before landing on Luke. The boy's lips parted in a soft smile, his face lighting up as if seeing a long-lost friend. There was no fear, no confusion, only joy. Luke, the faithful golden retriever who had watched over him, lay beside the bed, his presence a quiet reassurance. "Luke," Henry whispered, his voice weak but full of affection. His small hand reached out, trembling slightly to touch the dog's soft fur. Luke didn't move, but his body remained close, offering silent comfort. For a moment, it felt like time had slowed. Henry was awake, his eyes wide with the innocence of a child who had been given a second chance. But as Henry's fingers brushed Luke's fur, something shifted in the air. The dog, who had been so steady, so unwavering, gave a soft sigh. His body, once filled with a silent strength, seemed to relax all at once. His eyes, filled with wisdom beyond any creature's, slowly closed, and his chest, which had risen and fallen in rhythm with Henry's, now stilled. Sandra took a step forward, her breath catching in her throat. "No," she whispered, though the word barely escaped her lips. Luke was leaving, his purpose fulfilled. He had stayed long enough to watch over the boy, to ensure that Henry would wake, and now his time had come. The room seemed to hold its breath as Luke's final exhale slipped into the air. Quiet and peaceful, the weight of his sacrifice settled like a gentle blanket over the room. The golden retriever, who had appeared from nowhere and changed everything, had given his last breath to protect Henry. Henry, still smiling, seemed unaware of the profound loss unfolding beside him. To him, Luke was still there, his presence unwavering, his role as protector never in question. At the doorway, Mr. and Mrs. Knight stood in silence, their eyes brimming with both sorrow and gratitude. They had known, somehow, that Luke's presence was more than a coincidence. But now, as they watched his body still, they felt the weight of his departure. "He saved Henry," Mrs. Knight whispered, her voice breaking. She held her husband's hand tightly, feeling the loss not just of a dog, but of a companion who had given everything. He was sent to protect Henry, and he did. He has completed his final mission. Mr. Knight nodded, though his throat tightened with grief. Yes, he did. Sandra, Jackson, and Amy stood quietly by the bed, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that Luke had given his all. He wasn't just a dog anymore, not to them. He was a symbol of sacrifice, of love, of something beyond the tangible world they lived in. He had shown them what it meant to give everything without expecting anything in return. Jackson, who had been the most skeptical of them all, found himself blinking back tears. He had always relied on science, on logic, but Luke's presence had shown him that there were forces at play beyond what could be measured. Sandra stepped closer, kneeling beside Luke's body. She placed a hand on his fur, her fingers trembling. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice full of emotion. She didn't know what else to say. Words felt too small for the enormity of what Luke had done. The room fell into a deep, respectful silence. Luke's presence, though now still, lingered in the air, a reminder that love, in its purest form, required no explanation. The hospital's quiet halls, normally filled with the steady hum of machines and the soft shuffle of nurses' feet, felt heavier today. There was an air of solemnity that lingered like an unspoken prayer. In a small room near the children's ward, a memorial was being prepared. It wasn't a grand affair, just a simple gathering of staff, doctors, and the few who knew the story. It wasn't the kind of thing that usually happened in a hospital, but Luke wasn't an ordinary dog. Sandra, the head nurse, stood by the window, watching as the sunlight filtered through the glass, casting a gentle glow over the room. In her hands, she held a small photograph, one that had been placed there by Henry's grandparents, the Knights. It was a picture of Luke and Henry, taken just days before Luke had passed. In the photo, Henry, still weak but smiling, had one hand resting on Luke's golden fur. That image had become a symbol of something much deeper, something no one could quite explain. As the others began to trickle in, the room filled with a quiet murmur. Dr. Jackson arrived first, followed by Amy, both wearing expressions that hinted at the weight they had been carrying since the night Luke had saved Henry. For them, this was more than just a memorial. It was a reminder that not everything could be explained by medicine or science. There were forces at work that they, with all their knowledge, couldn't grasp. Sandra placed the photograph on a small table at the front of the room, next to a single candle that flickered softly. The Knights had insisted on this small gesture. For them, this wasn't just about saying goodbye to a dog. It was about honoring the being that had, in some mysterious way, given their grandson another chance at life. As the last few nurses filed in, the room fell into a contemplative silence. The hospital's chaplain, a quiet, thoughtful man named Father Thomas, stood at the front. He had been there the night Luke had passed, and even though he hadn't known the full story, he had sensed something special in that moment. Today, his words would be few, for this was not a service of speeches, but one of remembrance. "We gather here today," Father Thomas began softly, "to honor a life that touched us all in ways we may never fully understand." He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. Luke was not just a dog. In his final moments he showed us the power of love, the kind that transcends words, the kind that moves quietly, unseen but deeply felt. Sandra glanced at the photograph once more, her chest tightening with emotion. She remembered the way Luke had lain by Henry's side, protective and calm, as if he had known something no one else did. And then, his final sacrifice, the moment when he gave everything so that Henry could live. It was something she would never forget, something none of them would. Dr. Jackson shifted slightly, his hands folded in front of him. His usually pragmatic demeanor was softened today. He had spent his life relying on facts, on logic, but what Luke had done, it had shaken him. He couldn't explain it, and perhaps that was what unsettled him most. He had been present for countless medical miracles. But this was different. This was something beyond his understanding, and it left him feeling small, humbled. The knights, sitting near the front, held hands. Mrs. Knight, her eyes wet with tears, whispered, "Thank you, Luke. Thank you for saving him." Her voice was barely audible, but in the stillness of the room it carried. The ceremony continued in silence. A few more quiet words from Father Thomas, a prayer for Henry's continued recovery, but mostly it was a time for reflection. Everyone in the room knew that Luke had left something behind, something that wasn't just tied to Henry's survival, but to the way he had touched each of their lives in that brief but powerful way. When the candle finally burned low, Father Thomas nodded to the room, signaling the end of the ceremony. But no one moved. It was as if the love Luke had shared with Henry, the bond that had saved a life, still lingered in the air. And as they left the room, one by one, the sense of quiet reverence followed them. Luke was gone, but the love he had left behind was unshakable, a reminder that some connections, once made, can never truly be broken. As the hospital hummed back to life around them, the small group stood together, bound by the memory of a dog who had given everything for a child. Henry's laughter echoed softly, a new life unfolding, while Luke's quiet departure left behind a legacy of love and sacrifice that none of them would ever forget. If this story moved you as much as it did us, leave a comment and share which moment touched you the most. And don't forget to share this video with your loved ones, so they too can feel the deep message of love and sacrifice. Lastly, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you won't miss out on more inspiring and meaningful stories in the future. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.